The Outer Worlds is an action RPG created by Obsidian Entertainment. We play a colonist aboard a spaceship named the Hope who settle into the stars with hundreds of thousands of other people to colonize a star system named Halcyon. We are awakened from cryosleep by a scientist named Phineas Wells. He burdens us with helping him restore the other colonists because no one else is going to. It turns out there was a problem, and instead of a 10-year journey in cryo, we spent 7 years in it. There are a number of areas in the system, from planets or moons to spaceships and asteroids. Each of these places have their own missions, stories, and problems, but the biggest issue plaguing the colony was food insecurity. The leaders of this colony weren't politicians, but a group of capitalists who call themselves the Board. We can help them if we want, but our intended mission is to help Wells restore the rest of the Hope colonists still in cryo so they can fix all the problems created by their destructive business practices, or really just only a few of them. Due to the lack of upkeep in both infrastructure and the shutdown of anything that didn't stay profitable, the Board wants us to put everyone in cryosleep to solve the food problem. They hope they can convince people to join something called the Lifetime Employment Program, which would allow the Board to live out their lives in luxury without having to share any of the resources with the workers.
The Board shall provide for the deserving just as it always has.
There are a number of possible endings in the game based on your choices you made throughout it. Since there are so many variants in the story, I just want to focus on what I think is the best outcome for the system. This is the ending where you are able to revive all the Hope colonists from cryo and they start to solve the problems in the colony. This is most related to technology, the food insecurity, with some social reforms we don't get details about. When the Board is removed from control, we have the option to take an autocratic role of the system if we want. Even though we solved the food insecurity, brought technological advancement, there's still major problems that were brought up and never actually addressed. What I'm interested in looking at is the social commentary the game is presenting, what their solutions are to the problems, and the alternative suggestions we almost never see in these kind of games. I'm also interested in looking at why we don't see these suggestions in our media. Probably going to start with the story and the characters though, and then I'm going to get into accepted ideologies, and then move on to where it comes to these problems come from and my problem with it. This video will include political commentary, but the whole game is pretty much that, so if you are interested in that topic, I don't know why you're here. We should probably start with the story, but first a little disclaimer. I am a biased source of information, like every single other person on the planet. I grew up in the United States, and now I live in Canada, but my political views aren't exactly aligned with Western narratives. I am a socialist, and my videos are from that perspective. If you are looking for an unbiased news source, you are never going to find them. So let's just move on. The setting of the game is based on the Gilded Era, but in space. It was set in an alternative timeline like Prey was, but instead of JFK surviving the assassination, it was William McKinley. This meant Roosevelt never succeeded him, and as such, was never able to break up the big business trusts taking hold of the country. Eventually, an institution was formed named the Earth Directorate, who would regulate conflict between the corporations. A device called the skip drive was invented by the Earth Directorate, giving them an edge over the corporations. They started selling systems to the corporations for their ventures and recruiting people to help colonize them. 2 ships destined for Halcyon set out, the first one the Groundbreaker, and then the Hope. The Groundbreaker didn't have any issues and arrived just fine, but the Hope ran into problems and arrived 26 years later than it was supposed to. The Board eventually found it, and instead of awakening the colonists, they set them adrift around an icy planet. Due to the extra time in cryo, there were complications related to the unfreezing process. If the people in cryo were taken out of it, they would end up melting at the unfreezing process, but Wells suggested he could fix it. The Board wasn't interested though and denied this research, but that didn't stop him. He ended up conducting research in secret, but the Board found out and put a bounty on his head. After a few failures, he eventually succeeded with us. The Board found out he was on the Hope, and we were injected to one of the planets to meet a smuggler. This person's name is Alex Hawthorne, and he's supposed to be some gunsling cowboy type guy, but he's really not important to the story. He dies instantly because he's an absolute moron who didn't move out of the way of the receiver device. This caused him to die in like the Witch of the Wizard of Oz type fashion. You know what I'm talking about. That's fine though, since he left us the ship named the Unreliable. Don't get fooled by the name though, since it doesn't cause any problems once the power supply thing is fixed, but it's a good name. The Reliable doesn't sound nearly as good as the Unreliable does, so I get it. The year the game is set in is 2355. Due to our lengthy time in cryo, we have developed heightened mental and physical abilities. Not sure how or why, but it's much better than Melton, so it's certainly better than the 2 options. Before moving on, please subscribe to my channel. I put a lot of effort into these videos, so it would be nice to have some validation for that, and, you know, pretty much all my free time is into this now, so... Let's go over the character creation and get the leveling out of the way first. It doesn't play a part in the storyline, just how you develop your character. I won't go into detail about everything and just talk about what I liked and disliked about it. This is not going to be a comprehensive detail about the character creation and leveling system. To start, how your character looks does not matter. There's no surprise there, really. Very few games have that type of character building. And as much as people want to believe your choices you make for your skill attributes and all that stuff matter, they really don't. You could pretty much beat the game on the hardest difficulty without ever putting effort into your character. Just as long as you have the right skills for combat, you'll be fine. I know that because I beat the game twice on Nova difficulty without really trying that much. The level and perks aren't really that special except for the level 150 cap instead of 100. That's pretty cool compared to like other Fallouts and RPGs that use a point system. It helps to upgrade some of them to max, but things like dialogue don't really matter as much. The only 150 dialogue check in the game is in the DLCs, or at least I can't remember a 150 dialogue check in the base game. You'll have to tell me if there is an actual 150 dialogue check in the base game anywhere, because I can't remember seeing one. You'll pretty much bring a lot of the same perks depending on what you're doing. If you're bringing companions, you'll take the perks that go with them, and if you aren't, then you'll take the solo perks. Your weapon choice is similar depending on if it's ranged or melee. And if you decide to take flaws, you'll get extra perks for each one you take, but you can also get added damage if you have the perk that goes with the flaws, which is kind of nice. And because the flaws lower your attributes, you get a chance to getting low intelligence, which will give you the dumb trait. This gives you an opportunity to get some interesting dialogue lines, which are fun. You can even finish the game early if you have this, but you can also do this during the character creation and just have it from the start of the game, which is used for speedruns and stuff like that. There's a slight learning curve to the character creation, but as I said, it's not important. It helps, yes, especially in the early game, but the game really isn't hard enough or long enough to min-max your character every single fucking time. Max level is 36, which you will hit before the final mission if you're playing just to try to experience things. I hit it on the Murder in Eridanos DLC, which is before the final mission, and I had a few hours of gameplay after that where I wasn't really gaining any skills. While it did force me to think about what skills I actually wanted and didn't want, it feels very anti-gamer to hit max level before the end of the game. Worse, because this happened in all 3 of my playthroughs. It does make it easier to start a new game and try new things, but, I mean, come on. The problem with this is once you realize you're going to hit max level before you finish the end of the game, you're not really going to be incentivized to hunt down missions. And, like, for me personally, I didn't realize that this woman is the one that gives you the retirement district quest until my 3rd playthrough. I just stumbled upon the area and found my own way in rather than doing it through the quest. It is obvious this interaction with the quest giver is supposed to draw the player's attention in the hopes you'll talk to her, but are you going to sit there and tell me you didn't feel like just like turning your weapon on her?
Oh, there. That's one right there. Can't you just see the stench of impropriety radiating off of him?
Honestly, I would be more surprised if you didn't kill her and then reload your save than to actually talk to her normally. The game can get even easier if you found the prismatic hammer early in the game. I think you can get it at like level 6 or 7 or something like that, and it is by far the strongest weapon in the game, with like the Rizzo Gatling gun being the 2nd or something like that. So you figure that the best weapon in the game wouldn't be that hard to get, but it's kind of disappointing that it is. The Gorgon DLC melee weapon in the marketing art is a very tough weapon to get, and I think it is absolutely terrible. It took me like over an hour to get it just because I can't fast travel on Nova difficulty, so I had to walk around the area to get all the clues to unlock the door and get the weapon, only to find out that it was absolutely a terrible gravity ability to it. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if the gravity pulled directly to your front, and so you can hit it with the downwards smash and hammer move that you get, but it doesn't work like that. It can teleport to like one of your 3 sides, so it can left of you, right of you, or in front of you. And you know how many times I've missed because it pulled in a direction that I wasn't expecting? I don't like the weapon, and if it had a consistent pull, it wouldn't be so bad, but it's just not worth it. It looks cool. It looks like the coolest weapon in the game, but god, does it fucking suck. When you're building your character, you can probably manage your skills, bonuses, traits, equipment, and stuff you get, but you're going to waste so much time doing it, and the game really isn't long enough to really bother trying, like I said. You're only going to be really doing it for the last mission, and that's it. I thought maybe having like a max level of 50 would be better, but I kind of get why it's so low. As much as I hate that it's so low and that you hit it before the end of the game, if they gave you more points, you would just master all the skills you wanted to master, and that would be your build every single time you play the game. So having it level 36 with 350 points to use, you're kind of having to think about what you want to do for that specific playthrough. So even though I understand why it's the way it is, I don't like it. I don't like hitting max level before the end of the game. As soon as you get max level, you just don't want to do anything else because you're not growing your character anymore. The story is pretty straightforward. We fly around the system helping people run various errands. Most of our choices involve either helping the board or helping Wells or some corporation along the way. There are also a number of factions in the game that we can help, but really the factions are just corporations or individual little groups. Because this is an RPG, everyone we encounter wants us to do something for them before they help us, but in some cases we can pass a skill check. This is how developers turn the short story into a long endeavor. As of writing this, I have completed the game 3 times, but for life of me, I really don't remember the entire story. It's pretty much just running around talking to people, grab some chemicals, bring them to Wells, and revive colonists. Or skip the hope, that's right, that's what we have to do. But it's pretty straightforward. We also have to help someone on the radio, but it's a really short story. That's why the side quests are so much more interesting, along with the interactions with your companions and how they interact with each other. There are all different people from different walks of life with individual skills and passions, so depending on your pairing, you get some interesting dialogue. As I said, I'm just reiterating myself, really. Essentially, we have a survivalist, a moronic consumer who's generally terrible in combat, an engineer who's pretty shy, a religious nut, an advertising robot, and a rebellious rich kid. That's how I describe them, and really not entirely how the game sees them, especially with Felix. One of the companions, the shy engineer, was interacting with the survivalist and spoke about how she would have to work 16-hour days, 7 days a week, with like 8 hours off for sleep, but it wasn't always consecutive 8 hours. She also learned what a weekend was in this conversation, which is just incredibly sad. No one should have to live like that, but I mean, it's more and more common in our workplace today. She worked in a settlement that was directly controlled by the board, so their influence is much stronger there. Places that are off the beaten path or more secluded tend to have more loosened controls, which it allows them to have, weekends and stuff. Productivity is incredibly important to the colony and the board and all that. We encounter all kinds of ways they've tried to increase this within their workers. Most of these include some kind of drug, that have caffeine or speed-like properties. The Gorgon DLC added a drug that's supposed to allow workers to work multiple days straight without a break. This was called Adrenal Time. While tests showed people might be able to work 11 days without a break, it had massive side effects. The people who took the drug had a chance to go crazy and become marauders. And apparently they kill almost as many people as workplace incidents, but can't remember where the hell I heard that. This particular product you can prevent from going on the market, but unfortunately not every item you interact with is capable of that. When it comes to the diet toothpaste, you really can't necessarily prevent the product. You can only change how it's being sold. So instead of it being sold as toothpaste, you can sell it as rocket fuel, but that takes a specific ending. Otherwise, you're pretty much just deciding on who you're giving the recipe to. But it causes blindness, so that's, a thing. So the Adrenal Time would allow people to work multiple days without a break, and the diet toothpaste would reduce hunger, but we also get caffeine like pep pills and 2-hour energy or whatever it's called. There's just a lot of little things in there, but that's not it. Those ones only increase how efficient you are, how much energy you can, or how long you work. In the Murder DLC, or the Murder in Eridanis, they introduced Spectrum Brown. This was a new line of vodka set to be released, but the actress who was supposed to help release it was murdered. The entire DLC is a murder mystery. It's an extremely fun time the first time around. I won't go into it here because I accidentally deleted my section of it, and now it's gone, so I can't authentically respond to any of it without feeling bad, so it's just going to get cut. This vodka was interesting in the fact that it was infected with a parasite that changes the personality of the host. This was supposed to allow people to be extremely happy and overly pleasant and kind and courteous to a way that was just great customer service qualities generally. And of course, this one had problems too in the sense that it allowed the parasite to stick out of the neck, and too many parasites would infect the host in an aggressive way, and all these other fun things. And since these risks were to the employee and not the employer, they really don't care that much. Of course, every single one of these drugs was just to increase the worker productivity, reducing break times, food intake, sleep, or anything that would take them away from the work or to make customers upset. We see this in our own world where people pump coffee into their system to stay perky throughout their day or just fake a smile. People need a little bit extra to get through the day though, more than coffee that is. This is reflected in the game with all the other types of drugs that we see, but unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about it here. That's a whole another conversation about the drug use we have in our workplace, but let's move on to the healing item. So this thing here, the animation for it is like an inhaling thing, but the actual image of the item looks like it could be injected. So I had originally thought that this might have been like an injection that they wanted to do, but then changed it up for maybe obvious reasons. The whole social commentary of drug use in the workplace plus injecting yourself may not have been looked at as a very good thing for even the video game. So I suspect that it was changed, or I'm just looking into it too much. That's also entirely possible, but that's just something I want to add. The feeling of these workers in the game are probably similar to the feeling most of us have in our average workplace if you're an average worker. We all want to be more productive at work, so our hard work hopefully leads to success, but many people can argue that's really not how things work in our real world. Most of the promotions we see in our workplace aren't based on some form of hard work or determination. It's usually based on the arbitrary goals of the actual manager or what they see as a best fit for management. It's never really how hard you're working. In the game, we can find employee reviews that are similar to what we actually would see in our society. This isn't obviously a universal thing, and different managers have different goals and guidelines and whatnot that they hire through. The people that are generally enthusiastic about products and great at sales will often stay there because you're not really going to promote your best salesman, are you? Of course not. Graham, the leader of the iconoclasts that we will get to in the next section, worked for MSI and was flagged for having subversive undertones. I mean, that's kind of fair because he did end up leaving to start a revolution against the corporations. He's one of the prominent members of the iconoclasts who follow philosophism, which is a banned ideology within the Halcyon system. It is a mirror of the established religion, which is scientism. I guess the only key difference of them is they kind of switched the creation myth away. So scientism believes in a grand architect, while philosophism believes the creation of the universe happened in a natural way. But that's not important to the religion, and we're just going to move on until the next section where we'll talk about this stuff more. There are a couple more performance reviews, but the last one is related to a person who delegated tasks well and was set for promotion, but as we see, Sanjar was the one who got the promotion. The person's name was Dora, and I can't find any record of her really anywhere. I thought this person was maybe Zora, and she just changed her names, but it doesn't really seem to be the case, as Zora has a known history. As of writing this, I can't find anything about Dora anywhere other than this email, not even a Wikipedia page. So unless someone else found something, I'm really not going to continue wasting my time. I'm not even sure where to start looking for it. I wouldn't actually be surprised if Sanjar wanted her removed from the situation, though. Food insecurity is a major problem in the colony, as we're told time and time again throughout the game. Yet there are still a number of instances where food producing plants were closed down for little or no reason. Most of the time, things just started to break down and they didn't want to repair them, or they just didn't feel like paying their staff. When I was searching the area for signs of Dora, I stumbled upon some reports about entire loads of fish that became spoiled because they couldn't find a buyer for them. So while they claim there are food insecurities, they're still letting massive batches of food spoil just because they couldn't sell it. This literally happens all the time in our own grocery stores, where massive portions of our food supply are just thrown in the garbage just because it wasn't sold. It is even defended by the supporters of capital. There are other instances of this, one being C&P Bratwurst factory that Clive reopened. Clive was actually doing so well and making so much money off that factory that Sublight, one of the other corporations, wanted Clive gone and for them to take over. This was originally closed because the company just stopped paying their staff. Because, if you don't pay your staff, they're not going to come to work, obviously. So if they really wanted to solve the food insecurities, how about you not close the food production plants?
While the best and brightest of Byzantium continue living in prosperity.
There's actually this old quote from a book called The Grapes of Wrath that I think about a lot, especially while writing this. I'm going to put it on the screen, so if you want to read it, you can. But the TLDR that, if you don't want to read it, is that the food must rot so the value of the product remains. This is a very common business practice in our society, and we see the commentary of it here. The hungry people in the colony must stay hungry because it isn't profitable to just give them food for free. If you gave them food for free, they wouldn't go out and buy it. And while I think it's great that it's brought up in the game, it's not really critiqued. It's just in the background of the game as world building. I shouldn't say they aren't making these kind of critiques and judgments, since everything in the game is an assessment of the problems, but they aren't addressing the cause of it. There would need to be some kind of indication that they want to change these practices, but as I will get to, they really don't. Before moving on from MSI, I want to point out that they're considered one of the better companies in the system. Their CEO preaches worker-centric rights and democratic ideals. He is delusional though, and this is just a front to make him seem like a good person. He did give one of his kidneys to a board member to improve his standing, but it didn't work out for him. If you end up siding with them instead of the iconoclasts along with the board, he'll completely abandon these ideals just to sell luxury fish to rich people. I do have to give him some credit, I guess, since if you side with him and Wells instead of the board, his practices catch on a bit, but the problem is there's still issues that are considered anti-worker. Just because he supports mild worker rights, that doesn't mean he has a clear idea of what those are. If you go to the break room, you get an idea of what they believe in, so even if he preaches democratic ideals and worker-centric rights, he doesn't have any clue what those are. Let's talk about the final mission a bit. It's important to cover how the game actually ends because it plays a part in my analysis of the solutions presented to fix the problems. In the ending I'm going into, where Wells restores all the Hope colonists, Wells is kidnapped by the board and brought to the prison complex on Tartarus. We have to assault the prison complex and rescue him so we can start restoring the Hope colonists. We don't really need to insult it since we get an ID from the guard who contacts you upon arrival. So if you have the right dialogue skills, you can pretty much walk through the final mission. As we progress through the areas, we're only really going to face 2 people from the board. The first one is Rockwell, and he's an incredibly arrogant fool who didn't seem fazed the slightest when we walked through the door. You have the option to deal with him wherever you please, but I find a few chunks of lead or a smack to the head works really well in dealing with the fool. And then after him, you just have to face Ram, who's the prison warden. The robot's not hard. I made short work of it, even on Nova difficulty, without much of a problem. And I wasn't even using the prismatic hammer. This really doesn't play a part in the story, and it's just a big robot that plays the prison warden. It's actually really sad, and I don't understand why it's the final boss. We couldn't have put, like, any of these guys in a mech suit or something. That would have been way cooler. And then once you beat the useless robot, you just gotta go talk to Sophia or Rockwell, whoever's at the end of the game for you. It's a pretty anticlimactic ending, but that's really not a big deal to me. Generally, the game's a lot of fun. I just don't like the idea of relying on a group of smart people to come along and fix things. The whole premise of that bothers me. Really, my main point is even though that we deal with the board and revive the colonists, we don't really do anything against the companies. We are shown no indication that we put any of them out of business or forced any of them to change their business practices. We just got told there were some technological advancements, the food problems were solved, and there were some social reforms. We aren't told what these reforms were, but I suspect they were probably close to the reforms we saw in the American Progressive era. People say that this era sought to fix a lot of the corruption, poverty, exploitation, all the other kinds of issues that happened during the Industrial Revolution, but that is silly. Hardly 20 years later, they had the Great Depression, meaning that their fixes were temporary. After we remove these people from the board, we have the option to take control of the colony as an autocratic leader. I just don't like the fact that when Wells gave us the option to become the leader of the colony, he didn't really consult anyone else. This is just...
I can't imagine a better person for the job than you. What do you say, old friend? Will you help us?
This is obviously a very undemocratic process, but it's really not addressed or seemingly a problem in any way, shape, or form. It seems a lot of the commentary in these games tends to like a strong leader in control of things. This can work for society, but it will only last as long as we are around. Once an ambitious company gains enough power and want things to be back where they want it, minus the food insecurities, they'll just need to remove us from the picture. I will expand on this more in another section of the video, but I'm going to move on for now. My main point is the colonies can do better, but we're never really presented with an option to fix the actual issues in the colony. We're just expected to allow a group of smart people to come around and fix the problems. There's still a number of things I haven't spoken about, but I'll be here all day if I spoke about every single thing. Okay, there's actually one more thing I actually want to talk about. It's the early retirement district, where when you turn 65, your name's put into this daily lottery that if one, it lets you live out your days in luxury, only this is a lie. They butter you up with this like bullshit and then force you to sign this form. And once you do, you are sent down the elevator and are executed by robots. Then they turn you into meat cubes, but that's not important. This allows them to save a lot of money because all these workers that were working for a pension or something like that, they signed away all their rights. So now they have absolutely no chance of getting anything, and the companies save a lot of money. There's a quest associated with it that I brought up before, but that's not important. You can find this all out on your own by just killing your way through the place. So now you know the general story of the game. It's pretty straightforward. You help Wells or you help the board accomplish their goals, and then the game's over. Something we need to talk about are the beliefs in the colony. I figure they should have their own section because of how complex the topic is. There are 2 major ideologies in Halcyon. The first one is the board-approved religion called scientism, and then we have philosophism, which is banned by the board. We're introduced to scientism at the beginning of the game to ensure that we have an idea of how people think in the system. The general concept of the religion is that a grand architect created the universe along with a perfect system for it to function, and then stepped back, and no, we don't know anything about this architect. There's some kind of grand plan that everyone is part of, but no one knows what that is, just that they want to find out. Once they figure out the grand plan and its equation, everyone's past, present, and future will be known, and no one will ever question their place in life again. It talks a lot about how no one can defy this plan, and if they tried, they're pulled back aggressively, so... There are 6 pillars in the religion that are essentially their commandments. They're a bit more complex than the traditional commandments, with a few major pillars being just types of philosophy. I won't go into all of them, just the ones I find the most interesting. The first one I want to bring up is the major one, and that is survival of the fittest. I am sure you have an idea of what this means, but the use of it in the game is a little bit more different than just evolving into something better through natural selection. This is the social Darwinist type thing, where the rich are rich because they are better than the poor people. that's the kind of thing that they're doing here. Even though that this theory has been proven wrong time and time again, it hasn't really stopped people from believing that the Elon Musks of the world deserve their wealth. In the game, this belief puts the richest people at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and with the help of the other pillars, they take it with dignity and grace. The
Stoicism
pillar is that ideal, essentially, but it abuses its idea. Normally, you'd be able to handle hardship and tough times with dignity and grace as a sign of maturity, but here it's just meant to control people. It keeps people from complaining when their corporate overlords inevitably screw them over. This goes on for another pillar, referred to as determinism. Essentially says that personality and traits are predetermined. This means that there isn't any real free will. This is fine though, since the entire religion is just really created to control the masses, which is also why the board put a ban on any opposing religion, or more specifically, philosophism. Philosophism is practiced by a faction called the iconoclasts. They see the universe as a natural phenomenon with no actual purpose to it. They have much more spiritual beliefs that involve an eternal truth and awakening. They don't really have any real direction or long-term planning in their system. They just look to live out their lives as survivalists. If you do get rid of Graham and let Zora take over, while also removing MSI from the area, they will see success, but this is limited to Zora's leadership. Like Rome, a strong leader can lead to success, but once they die, you get a Caligula. So I believe it's better to have something that's more concrete, but I will talk about that more in the next section. It's a little strange, but I still find it really entertaining that the scientism religion has created beliefs and based half of the religion on philosophy, while also the creation and natural phenomenon have like the spiritual doctrine. I want to avoid insulting any religious people that might be watching this. I don't really give my opinion on any of these beliefs, really. I just believe that it's important to see how the religion is used against the people and to control the perception of things. The board has used scientism as a means to focus efforts and to create a complacent colonist who will work hard for long hours and not complain. That even if they wanted to complain, it would just be seen as sinful and heresy. It does believe in scientific advancement, but the people in charge are deciding on what that is based on the needs of the colony, or really themselves. So pretty much what I spoke about before with the drugs and consumer goods. One of our companions is a follower of scientism, along with his family, or kind of, not really. Even though he believes wholly in the doctrine, he isn't satisfied with his place. He wanted more out of life, but he thought the life of a laborer was below him. This led him to search for the text that could expand his understanding, but the book he was looking for turned out to be written in French.
French? I can't fucking read French!
Long story short, we meet a hermit on an asteroid and go on a vision quest. Max was looking to have the same satisfaction his family had, but he abandoned his family to find it. In his vision quest, he sees his mother, or at least a vision of her. She tells him that he needs to let go of the past, and the only way he'll feel good about life is if he accepts the chaos of the universe. Scientism puts the universe within a perfect system that you would be able to predict if you kept looking and experimenting, but what his mother is telling him went against everything he ever knew. Instead of the comfort of reason and the grand plan, it was the uncertainty of chaos. Once she tells him she made herself happy, she tells him that he is the only one holding him back and leaves. She essentially is telling him that there isn't a purpose to any of it and that he should find a way to make himself happy instead of chasing an impossible goal, or something like that. I really don't read a lot of philosophy. Max is then faced with a version of himself, one that is confident and in control, but this really isn't him. This is just who he imagines himself to be, like one that he holds as a standard. Max wants to be disciplined and in control and no longer have doubt, but what real joy would that actually bring him? The hallucination asks him if achieving his goals in scientism would really make him happy. He fought against everything up to this point, but once he acknowledged that the ideas of the Grand Architect was nonsense, his defenses started to drop. He eventually comes to this conclusion.
Of course there is pain and loss, but the suffering is caused by trying to control reality, clinging to the way you want things to be, not enjoying the way they are.
I don't really have an issue with the conclusion he came up with entirely, but its implications don't fundamentally change the person. Scientism was designed to create a person who is content with their life being crap, but this just changes by just telling them that they should be happy with crap because they don't really have control of things anyways. That trying to change things is trying to control chaos, and that just causes more suffering. I don't agree with this because it ignores the entire purpose and point of what caused the problem in the commentaries we see throughout the entire game. When we enter areas abandoned by the board, we usually find out what caused the settlements to become abandoned. A large portion of the game is just being shown all the ways corporations screw over the people for their benefit. We can look at the botanical gardens, Cascadia, the asteroid the Hermit was on, and so on. Every one of these places saw suffering from the actions of not acting to fix the problems, or just because of a whim. Suffering was caused by not acting against preventable chaos. I don't have a problem with accepting what you can't control, but this is just saying that the actions of capitalists are uncontrollable chaos. Don't bother fighting the corporations because they're just part of our life and there's nothing you can do about it. You'll just cause unneeded suffering if you try. His family learned to be content with their situation and found happiness, which is what we should all find. I just don't believe the situation on Halcyon was natural chaos, but the actions of selfish individuals who put these people in bad situations for their benefit. There's just one thing before moving on to the next section. I found an interesting piece of information I don't really know what to do with. In the early retirement section, there's this solar system map, but it's not a normal one, it's a geocentric map of the star system. This means that a planet is in the center and not a star. I really don't see information about this in the game anywhere else, but it is rather interesting. We run around Halcyon in the heliocentric map when we travel, so yeah, this is just cool. I like the heliocentric and the geocentric maps. In this next section, I don't want you to look at this like an assessment of the actual game or the developers. It might appear as I'm targeting them at times, but my point would be directed at our society. It's centered around the choices that our liberal society deems acceptable. The developers are just subjects to capital within a system that uses the common understanding to manipulate the narrative. While playing, it's hard not to think about all the similarities between the game's world and our own. It expresses these ideas in a fantasy-style FPS adventure, but that doesn't make their criticism any less valid. They show the problems and how corporations influence society, but their solutions rely heavily on a group of smart people to come and fix the worst of the problems, while leaving the cause of the problems to continue their practices. If we relate this to our own world, we can see that they're criticizing our focus on capital gains and not the recommendations of the scientific community, or more specifically, our hope is in a group of smart people to save us from the worst of our problems. We can of course choose to support corporations, but that isn't our main purpose when we restored from cryo. Help and the hope was technically our actual purpose, but freedom of choice is still kind of present. The colony is falling apart even in the rich areas, because repairing things is a cost taken away from the requirement of infinite growth. In a world where the material conditions are at their worst for a majority of people, with cost of living, food insecurity, crumbling infrastructure, and addiction, we should be seeing signs in certain types of anti-capitalist movements, but the closest thing we get to are religious revolutionaries looking to do nothing but kick out the corporations, or marauders. It would be closer to a group of religious people wanting to practice their religion without being prosecuted, with some anarchism mixed in. It should be noted that they're willing to work with MSI in some of the endings, so they're not entirely anti-capitalistic, but more just a pro-scientism. And Graham has a chip on his shoulder for some situations that you can find out if you play the game. There is a reason why we don't actually see these movements here, but it's a bit of a complicated topic, so it'll take some time to go over. First things first, the social reforms seen in the colony are probably closer to that of the progressive era that preceded the Gilded Era. This is just an era of fixing problems with corruption and some social activism within a capitalist nation. As nice as it sounds, there are parts of the era that are often ignored. Nothing stopped the corporations from continuing their exploitative practices at the cost of certain types of people in society deemed lesser related to race or class. Since people don't really care about poor groups considered non-white by the time, the reforms don't usually consider them. Progressive era still saw restrictions in immigration based on nationality and the forced sterilization law by country, along with deepening the survival of the fittest and eugenics. Those beliefs only fell out of favor due to Nazi Germany, so I'm not saying this is what happened in the outer worlds after the border was removed, but my point is that our media likes to romance this time. By the end of the era, there were many violent protests happening for better workers' rights. Socialism was on the rise, but the government and owner class weren't having it. This era ended with the First World War, which saw a lot of laws passed that prevented people from speaking against the establishment. This caused a lot of suspected communists to get arrested. This is important because a lot of the points I'm going to be making revolve around America's capital owners' hate for communism. Allowing the board and the companies that were part of it to exist would just give them another chance to grow their strength. And it would only be a matter of time before they solved their differences and made moves against our newly formed undemocratic government. Some of these groups might even see themselves as the rightful owners of the system due to the previous purchase made when they formed the colony. I would even argue this would happen within 1 or 2 decades after us taking leadership, since the growth of a company can happen very quickly. If they're doing it right by explaining wages, product quality, increasing pricing, and saving money by not properly disposing of hazardous waste, which is all present in the game, it wouldn't take that long to get there. It's not like there's a real military to back us up either. The crew left us to do their own thing, so we're pretty much just left alone with whoever the colonists decide to join us. It's hard to say how many Earth military remains at the end of the game, since the Universal Defense Logistics provided a lot of the military power for the system, and they were also one of the corporations kicked out by the government. So should avoid speculating too much on the possible ways they'll regain their power. It's kind of more important to move on to the influences that lead some people to see relying on a group of smart people to come and fix our problems as the only reasonable option, and why certain options are never present in these games. In the American news media, we have a few major perspectives that influence society. That is Fox News on the right and CNN on the left, with a few other groups in between that don't really want change, so they just stir confusion and debate. Regardless of which one you prefer, they're fundamentally the same thing. They all support the market and capital. After all, they sign their paychecks. There have been a number of other news medias over the years, but a majority of these groups have similar views about the market and how we arrange our economy. To ensure the ideas in the market economy stay as the only sensible economic system, institutions were formed by various rich peoples over the years. These would mostly just act as propaganda machines for private capital. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and Brookings claim to be nonprofit, but they've provided a very important purpose to the system. They produce studies and data that validate the narratives that the market economy and businesses are good for society and innovation for corporate media. This isn't exactly the extent of their research, but a majority of their work involves some form of private industry good for society type of content. Usually they write these things by cherry-picking data or comparing fundamentally different systems by the same goals and guidelines. An example of this would be the idea we have of poverty. If we look at how it's measured, you can see how suspect the system is. If you're an individual who does not live with a family and make more than $13,800, you're above the poverty line. But they doesn't actually consider where the people actually live, so it could be in LA, New York City, or Detroit. It's the same calculation no matter what. And this is worse if you think about the fact that it says a family of 4 making $27,000 a year is above the poverty line no matter where they live. But this isn't even my biggest grief. There is absolutely no mention of healthcare, childcare, or transportation in the cost of calculation. While health services are brought up in their research, it's not actually part of the calculation. This can be expensive and bankrupt people depending on what they're dealing with at the time, so it's insane not to bring it up in the poverty census. I wasn't being entirely honest about the origin of the study. It was the Congressional Research Service who produced the report and not one of the private institutes. They produce studies that Congress uses to make decisions for society. Fun stuff. I wanted to bring it up here because I want an example of how government agencies are just as much involved in the propaganda as Brookings or Fox News. It's important to make a point against people who actually say capitalism is bad, see how many people were pulled out of poverty because of it. The data they are using to make this judgment is heavily manipulated to benefit the narrative. A real example of how these think tanks conduct research would be something like how Brookings did for Chinese propaganda. All they really did was take a term that was obviously related to China, Xinjiang, then made claims that everything that came up from Chinese origin was propaganda, that every pro-Chinese stance was instantly state-controlled disinformation. Now, this is my opinion on this research. No one who writes these reports gives even the littlest fuck about the Chinese people. The reason this region of China is the one in subject is because of the negative information about the subject that they can push. This specific study brought up something I was going to get to, but it's important to bring it up here because it was brought up. The way these institutes, agencies, and media influence society's opinions about what sources we accept as fact. I do have to give a disclaimer about the previous section. There is a lot of propaganda coming out from China about certain topics I won't bring up, but this isn't different from what the USA is doing or other major powers. I won't defend China's actions and their government, and I find that both Western narratives and state Chinese media's narratives to be problematic. The truth is often lost when two powers compete with each other. Whatever is happening in the area, China's not being honest about it, and Western media thinks the worst of it. My main point is there has been an effort to make people see the Western source or non-state media source as the only trustworthy options. And I don't even want to get into the Wikipedia pages, political sections, because these have their own biases in them. Some of the only state narratives that are accepted are the ones that are made from the United States run agencies. So, like the one I spoke about before with the poverty rates, those are the ones that are really accepted by the Mass Project, mostly because they like regurgitating it, like, oh, see how many people we brought out of poverty, even though the rating for poverty is massively skewed. Since these foreign narratives can conflict with the narratives from the private sources we get, many people just prefer their news to be filtered through their respective media outlet. You might have even thought or asked if there was a Western source to a story because of the mistrust that our society has placed in these foreign perceptions. This has been an effort to control the narration by the media and people who want to maintain the status quo. This has been happening for well over a century, but let's focus on us still before we move on to the propaganda. Most of us are born, raised, and educated on how great the capitalist system is with no context to the price paid in developing nations, the environment, or what is stolen from the workers. For a very long time, America has promoted American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, and the exception of perilous actions, while ignoring what these are and the actions included in it. This isn't just an American thing, since most countries considered developed have some form of imperialist action that prop up their economy. These countries are all capitalist, so it only goes to reinforce my point. Groups like the CIA have waged wars on culture and nations with ideologically different views too, so they can implement their own government. It makes it easier for companies to come in, exploit the resources and workers for the benefit of capital owners. Most of these ideologically different countries are often communist nations, but you won't hear anything good said about them from the Western media. It has always been funny to me that Americans will be quick to accuse countries like the Soviet Union for their actions, then go about their day like their government hasn't subjugated nations for their own benefit, Cuba being one that they're extremely pissed about losing, and they make a great effort to demonize it in the media, mostly through misleading the public. They want to bring freedom back to Cuba, so they need the American public to hate their government. This makes it easier for groups like the CIA to come in and overthrow the government without the American public. They've essentially manufactured positive opinions about the actions by pushing Cuba government bad and they need freedom kind of stories. There are differences in political groups like conservatism and liberalism, but there isn't a huge difference in their economic policies. Generally how it works is the liberals want minor regulations while the conservatives want almost no regulations, except for things related to non-white immigrants, women, religion, and drugs. It's a fake game of tug-of-war with no intended end. These groups just want people to fight with each other and not think about the other possible systems that would actually benefit society as a whole instead of just the people who own the media. This false choice is orchestrated by what I call a dictatorship of capital. So while you're presented with a choice, it doesn't make a difference who's in power. Criticism of this can be seen in all over our media, but like the outer worlds, nothing is being offered that is better. Most people understand our democratic choices suck, but the idea is we need to accept this necessary evil. Just like in the business world's ideology, while they cause a lot of problems, they're ultimately the best option for society. I don't believe I need to go into why people think capitalism is the best, since that's what we've been educated on. It helps that society has adapted a hyper-individualistic mentality and a forced personal responsibility take to many problems. This is reinforced by mainstream media, the business world, and many of those institutions I mentioned before. This makes criticizing the system much more difficult on the marketplace of ideas because people's understanding of the system are fundamentally flawed, hence why debates are so dumb. For some positions, you need to establish a baseline of understanding which isn't provided. People are becoming more aware of the facade that is our democracy, but ghouls like Dr. Carlson have doubled down on their war against the woke culture and currently follow his word have gone more extreme. It's becoming impossible to debate ideas since no one can agree on basic fact. Economics being a topic with the least productive debates because the understanding of economics and how they function are fundamentally flawed. This is directed at those of you who say you just don't understand economics. No, you're just conditioned to defend the economic system. What we learn about the market economy is presented as objective truth in the standard understanding. Then it is backed up by those institutes that cherry-pick data to validate the narratives. We can look back at scientism where its ideas are just the basic understanding of the world and thus it shouldn't be questioned. Many people only learn the function of the established one. This is deliberate since the government officials want to keep the market and along with all the capitalists that fund them. For me, being an American living in Canada, every single time a planned economy is brought up, it is instantly disregarded as a failed system. Economy classes would rather leave it as a footnote or an example of what never to do. We're presented with the idea of choice, but our choices only consist of the aspects of a market. Let's talk about this dictatorship of capital now and why it's important. I brought it up before, but you probably really don't know what it means. A dictatorship of capital is when money dictates policy and opportunity life. If a policy is unfavorable to the invisible hand that controls the economy, then the capitalists will do a number of things to prevent it. One of them is to send in their money and do what is called a capital strike. They won't invest their money, and this screws up the market. They will also want to take their money elsewhere, which leads to politicians forcing on policy that doesn't upset capital. When capitalists threaten to take their money and leave, this is called a capital flight. It's effective at maintaining control of a system while also appearing as democratic and free. Governments often rely on the market so they can use investments as they need, so a capital strike is bad for the economy, and a capital flight is unacceptable. An example of this would be the local government investment pools, or LGIPs for short. They use excess funds to invest in the market for potential benefit of the group of investors. This means investment back into poorer communities can be considered a bad investment compared to putting money into these GLIPs that could see a return, which they hope would in turn create more funds for the community in theory. The reality is they just use it to maintain the rich areas. This doesn't even include how much money politicians get for private industry to ensure capital interests are upheld, or how politicians are allowed to individually invest in the market that they're supposed to be keeping in check. I could actually spend hours talking about how politicians are owned by, capital, but I gotta keep this moving. When the too big to fail companies screw up and need a payout for their mistakes, the government is always quick to recover their losses, and of course the CEOs and boards still get their bonuses. People call this corporate socialism, but really it's just the dictatorship of capital keeping its interests in check. For the rest of us without capital, we are fired, and then it is reflective in our work history. This usually leaves the majority of people in tough positions, and it only makes worse because of the fact that a company can fire you without notice. But you're still expected to put in notice so you don't cause an inconvenience to them. Some countries have protections for workers, but companies can get around this in a number of ways. In Canada, where I live, a business will likely just reduce your hours to nothing or write you up for even the most minor of incidents, or anything at all, really. The capital owners have so much control over our lives to call ourselves anything other than a dictatorship of capital would be disingenuous to the function of our capitalist governments. This includes not only the workers in rich nations, but the countries who are victims of their imperialist actions. To this day, most of our coffee, chocolate, and clothing are produced by these countries for the benefit of ourselves. I had a section here about how being poor was expensive and the various ways the dictatorship keeps people down, but Some More News made an hour-long video based on how being poor is expensive, so you should just go check that out if you want to learn more, but just finish this one first. Just open it in like a new tab or something and you can watch it after this one. I just hope you aren't watching this on the toilet because it's not sanitary, but you know what, you do you. Something else that shows we live in a dictatorship of capital is voting with your dollar. I'm sure you've heard it before. This essentially just means you buy products from companies you like and you don't from companies you don't like. But this really isn't how things work. Just another illustration of how the dictatorship of capital makes it appear you have freedom of choice. There are like 100 companies that sell you pretty much everything, so you don't really have a real choice in who you buy from. These aren't monopolies per se, which allows them to avoid those monopoly laws, but they really don't compete with each other. They only need to appear like they're competing with each other for public image. This leads to the ideas we have about freedom, that we have it because we can start a business and become rich, but this freedom isn't for a majority of people. It ignores the need for people to actually work to get things done. Jobs that need to get done are never jobs that make you rich, but getting rich requires you to exploit the situation for your benefit. So, essentially, if you're a working class person, you'll never be rich. Being rich is reserved for the owner class who take the surplus from themselves, and it isn't something that everyone can actually accomplish. Even less nowadays than in the past, since the capitalist race has been going on for a long time now. And those who exploit more are always going to be able to outcompete the worker-focused businesses like the MSI in the game. They will have more capital to invest and thus have a more profitable business on the market. There are always big players in these games of Monopoly, and they're always looking for new ventures to expand their wealth. Businesses need workers to operate, and the owners aren't keen on doing this stuff themselves. This means that our society will always have a working class that is expected to make sacrifice for the owner class. These people provide capital and then expect the surplus for themselves. This is a system of the dictatorship where we live in only to provide labor for the capitalists to make money. These people don't even invent or create anything themselves and just take credit for the hard work of their employees. In the outer worlds, this would be the people living in Byzantium, a class who don't produce anything and yet still extract the surplus for themselves. And because numbers must go up, they look to cut costs. This is even considered one of the benefits of capitalism, by the way. Yes, making things cheaper is good, but as long as it isn't at the cost of the life of the product or its quality. Capitalists really only put money into something called planned obsolescence. This is shortening a product's life so people will have to buy it again sooner. It does make sense. If you're a company that makes fridges, you don't want your customers to come back 25 years from now. You want them to come back 7 years if you can. The business world requires constant income, so it doesn't benefit them to make products that customers don't need to buy again. A majority of the money of actual research, innovation, and development comes from government funding. In the outer worlds, they don't actually get support from Earth, so they have to rely on their own resources, which they completely mismanage for their own personal luxuries. Pushing productivity of the existing workers helps increase their profits too. Less employees with lower wages means more money for the business, so it doesn't benefit capital to increase it. As the years go by, productivity has increased, but wages haven't, meaning workers are getting more work done for less money and less staff. This ties in with the philosophical perception of capital. It is important to capitalists that they don't provide too much to the employee or else they get lazy and productivity suffers. Some Bernard fellow from the Netherlands spoke about this in the early 18th century and it still echoes in our media today. You can pause and read the quote if you like, but it's just a long-winded way to say that you need to keep workers poor or they get lazy, and since slaves aren't allowed anymore, having a reserve labor force struggling and willing to work for almost nothing is better for capital. For America, they have the 13th Amendment, which makes it so federal criminals are essentially slaves, hence the prison populations. These societies I've been speaking about often have some kind of political system that represents itself as democratic, but capital controls the candidates and the policies they support, regardless of what party they belong to. As I said before, really I'm just reiterating myself. Most people watching this understand the ideas of the liberal democracy. In the United States, we have Republicans and Democrats. If you're in Canada, you have a few more, but the large ones are the Liberals, Conservatives, and the Democrats. It's a common belief they need to vote for one of these major groups so they don't waste votes. This works well for capitalists because they don't really have to worry about a new political party taking the government and interfering with their practices. People like Bernie Sanders might seem like a radical person compared to the other options, but he still supports the market economy. He's just looking for a more democratic socialist structure that looks to use the market to fund social programs with regulations of businesses. While it seems like a good idea to people brought up in this neoliberal landscape, there are important issues that come from this. Capital still influences society to a large degree, so with even regulations against businesses, it's a constant battle between capital interests and worker interests, which are in direct conflict. As long as there's a market in place and politicians can benefit from it, they're going to side with capital because they have personal investment into it. Most of the social democracies people like to look towards benefit from imperial actions just like the United States and Canada do, even if it's to a lesser degree. These systems also will work for a period of time, but capital always wears away at it eventually. This isn't exactly related to my point because the Outer Worlds doesn't actually have a democratic process even after we take control of the colony. We are given it to it by wealth without an election, so the corporations don't really even have to buy a politician. They just need to avoid problems with us until they're strong enough to take back the system, and that shouldn't take that long, really. I believe that an important aspect of a functioning democracy is they're able to get things done. The way it's set up now is you're never really allowed to act against capital interest. While we do have minor worker rights, it's only ever just enough to keep people desperate and hopeful for something better. In the game, where we can only stop the political control and can barely affect the company's practices that actually affect the people's lives, so we really aren't changing much. The Outer Worlds is trying to tell us that we need to start listening to the scientists and not let companies have control of the government or something along those lines. While it does make sense that we need to listen to scientists, they won't be able to fix the long-term problems created by capitalism. Companies don't need to be in direct control to have control. They just need to direct policy in the direction that doesn't hurt their wealth. My problem with the developers trying to critique the system is that their material conditions don't allow them to see business as an issue. It is looked at like a necessary evil. They are just suggestions made by well-off individuals benefiting from a system and were brought up being told that this is the only option we have. The conditions the workers deal with within the Outer Worlds are terrible, and it doesn't take an academic to see it doesn't need to be this way. People would see Byzantium as a problem and would look to take back the production for workers producing all the goods and services. The iconoclasts might be mistaken for this, but they're survivalists. They want freedom from corporations and an anarchical system and aren't looking to create a new society with worker control. Anarchists believe in common usage and not public ownership. We see a couple instances of people reopening factories for their own benefit, like Clive reopened a bratwurst factory for their own benefit, but that just shows places were closed for arbitrary reasons. You can ban philosophy and certain ideologies if you want, but the criticism of the capitalist system will always come up again. They won't be well defined or laid out like some of the anti-capitalist ideologies we have due to the lack of material on the subject, but they would still exist in some form, and I will come back to this. What I see in the Outer Worlds is a repeat of history, but not the history the Outer Worlds likely experienced in its past. It'll be the same problem that arises whenever capitalists are allowed to operate. They will compete and a company comes out on top, and then the companies are broken up and the race begins again, except the capital owners never really lose their wealth or connections. In the game, these companies are never broken up in the first place. We only remove the board from the colony, not these businesses. I know I'm repeating myself, but I find it important to reiterate this fact. A majority of the rich people can get back in the game very quickly from exploitative practices I mentioned before. One of the ways that rich people can get back in the game really easily is the massive loans that they can get with very low interest because they're considered good investments. This is opposed to the type of loans poor people can get because they're considered bad investments, but in some more news already covers this, so that's a really good video, check it out. Nowadays, companies have learned that they need to maintain a shroud of competition, but really they just compete against companies trying to play their game. There are usually a handful of businesses in each sector of the economy that dominate trade. As long as these groups exist, their efforts won't stop, and their expectation of growth will always remain. They will seek power, and so they can practice business as they want and not be forced to treat their employees like people. This is why expecting a group of smart people to come and fix our issues won't solve the problems in the long run. Capitalists can't be trusted and aren't even necessary. Usually a state-run industry can do everything private industry can without the profit motive ruining the product, worker rights, the environment, or pricing. It isn't exactly easy for people born and raised on Western beliefs in a middle or upper class family to correctly assess the problems in the system. They can see stories on the news and read about it, but they really don't know unless they grew up in it or live in it. Lead developers that make choices on these games aren't worrying about when their next meal will be, or if their paycheck's going to allow them to survive another month. They don't really have the material conditions to correctly assess the problems in the system, and from their point of view, capitalism has brought them so much opportunity. They don't see capitalism as a fundamental problem, so the only suggestions they can come up with is to remove corporations from governmental control and let smart people come and fix the worst of the problems. Most people don't even bother to see past capitalism or believe this is the end state for civilization, which is depressing. The people working in game development are exploited too, just don't get me wrong on that. They just aren't the people in society who see the worst working conditions and wages. The worst working conditions that provide for a society aren't even from our own nation. Now, to loop back to my main point, there's only been one system to really fight against capital interests, and that is communism. I know it's a scary word, but that is because our neoliberal media has interests in capital along with the government, like I've been talking about for a while now. Since communism actively fights against capital interests in favor of the worker, corporate media needs to actively fight against it for its own goals. Just to be clear, some communist nations use mixed economies. The important part is that capitalists don't control policy. Then we have socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is its own things. I'm not well versed in that one, to be completely honest. The West is always quick to make judgments against the Chinese economy in incredibly unnuanced ways, so I won't bother going into them. I spoke about the Soviets in my last video and brought up their planned economy, but to go in what I said there, they were really successful for being one of the first social experiments, France having the first one. Even with all the pushback from external powers and counter-revolutionaries and capitalists, they showed other poor workers being exploited around the world that there's a better choice. They succeeded in bringing a nation out of poverty and put it in a position to make change for itself and other people. And within a few decades, they were able to send rockets into space, leading to the first satellite, Sputnik, all with a planned economy and limited computer technology. Managing resources for a planned economy was one of the leading faults of the system, but this is a moot point under modern computer technology. Their planned economy brought freedom to a poor and illiterate nation and gave it something to unite over. Because it doesn't let capitalists control labor and commodity goods or allow them to participate in politics, the West says that it restricts freedom. But that is coming from the perspective of the exploiter. Our system shows how capital and business influences political policy. Indirect criticism of this can be seen all over the game. Restricting these groups of people is required, or else they will influence society for the benefit of capital owners. The only way to achieve a society that benefits the masses is to remove the ability for the rich people to gain control through their capital. This is something we don't see in the outer worlds. We run around the system making change, but our only choices are to help the project, which usually helps the business, or to shut it down, with a few medium options in between. We're really never given the option to reopen, redistribute, or unionize anything. The houses likely remain closed with the evicted on them, and things like the power plant don't seem to ever get fixed. We have no indication that the people ever focused on infrastructure, education, just some geoengineering. People worried less about food and technology got better, and there were some social reforms, but as I said, that doesn't really mean much in a liberal society. The situations of Byzantium only forced some people to get jobs. The people who make these games are not suffering or struggling, are not able to see what has provided so much for them as a fundamental problem. So when they go to critique the system, the only suggestions they're able to use is what information they can access and make judgment based upon common understanding. It's just funny because this is what essentially scientism is intended to do. The liberal narratives see business as a net positive for society, so its removal is inconceivable. Our trustworthy media sources said communism failed system, so we shouldn't even consider it when we're looking to make change. They've built an empire of propaganda that spans over 100 years that they can use to back up their narratives. As of writing this, I went to look up some old Red Scare propaganda to see some of the ways the media was presenting communism in the early days, and in one, they actually suggested to fight communism with money, so there's that. It was in the 1950s, and it was supporting free radio in Europe to spread propaganda to the communist nations that could receive them, of course. Wait. Crusade for Freedom. What is that? Oh, nice. CIA. Yeah, not surprised to see them related to anti-communist propaganda, like, at all. They fought culture wars against it because, capital interest. It is extremely easy to find proof that the CIA involved themselves in the overthrow of communist governments. Yeah, but this is acceptable to Western media and its viewers. Most of the early days of the fight against communism, they would just label all communist supporters as radicals and arrest them, hundreds at a time, judging by the newspapers I was able to find. I found another piece that suggested that bad washrooms could create communists. They're looking at you, Amazon. No, I'm kidding. This is from Scott Paper Towel brand. They were bought up in the 90s by a company looking to remove competition from the market, so yeah, it doesn't really matter. Corporations have contributed to a lot of the anti-communist propaganda we've seen in the past, since they know communism restricts corporations from exploiting their workers for the benefit of the owner. This is where that communism restricts freedom argument comes from. These narratives were presented by many popular American brands and have certainly influenced society. The developers even took the main image from the propaganda wiki and remade it for the game. This piece was originally meant to encourage people to join the army to fight against the Nazis, so it's interesting to see him related to philosophism. In our society today, we're seeing more and more people open their eyes to the problems of the capitalist system. This presence is more online than in person, but the older generations still support corporate media narratives. Some context to this piece, actually, was it was made by the writer of the Angry Beaver cartoon. The Outer Worlds isn't telling us to get rid of the corporations or to see past it. It's just saying that we should have a more modest capitalism and not let companies exploit everything it can. The problem with this is it already has. It did a long time ago. In our world, capital has funded fascist movements, which will only make work reforms even more difficult to accomplish, since it's another hurdle that the working class has to fight against. I use the trucker convoy as an example in the imagery here, but I'm not saying the trucker convoy itself was a fascist movement. It's just that many people that were part of it support fascist ideas. One of the best ways to combat this is to educate yourself on the topic of politics so you can understand the landscape. Yes, I am going to tell you that you need to read and learn theory from a leftist perspective, but if you're part of the working class, which statistically speaking is likely, then this is the perspective you want. We need to educate ourselves on something better so we can work past it. Politics is an important aspect to all of our lives, and it only benefits the rich people to ignore it, since most of them are involved in it. You don't really have to read theory right away. You can start with one of the many socialist creators on YouTube. I suggest you go check out the people at the Deprogram podcast that are really good. Each of them have their own respective channels that can help understand the many different areas and topics of the subject. Eventually, the interest of the subject should spark, and reading theory will become easier. I just personally suggest you don't jump right into the theory they base their stuff off of right away. The terminology and the way they talk about things can get pretty complicated if you don't understand the context. Many people in our society realize something is wrong. We get a number of people who fall into conspiracy theories like the Flat Earth Society, QAnon, or the Illuminati. This isn't a failure in their character, at least I don't see it as one. These people have a feeling inside telling them that there's something wrong. They just don't know what that is. Society and material conditions don't allow them to see capitalism as the problem. Many of these people are in the working class or the upper classes, but not rich. They're just part of the exploited majority, even if their labor is valued a bit more than others. The people who research secret society stuff is closer than people give them credit for. No, I do not believe in the Illuminati, but I do believe rich people get together and make plans that affect millions of people. This isn't like a Rothschild type thing, but a problem with capitalism. The Bohemian Club being one of the ones that can certainly make people wonder. It's important to remember that this isn't as grim as it is in the movies, or as people might imagine. These are just rich people in powerful positions who control large portions of our economy getting together with a single understanding, that they are rich and that they want to preserve that. Even if they don't agree on anything else, the club still supports these ideals. This isn't an exclusive class made up of very few people. They can work together for the common goal of capital, but this is different for the working class. We have so much less power, so the only way we can succeed is by a large enough portion of the working class to make a combined effort against capital. Keeping us divided prevents worker action, and that's partly because the mainstream media is forcing it onto people. And no, you centrists are not any better, and you're not fucking enlightened because you're in the middle. No, you're the worst of the group. As it stands now, people believe we will have capitalism until we solve scarcity. This sounds right on a planet with limited resources, but by now, you should see that scarcity doesn't play a part in this. Even if Star Trek-like synthesizers were developed, capitalists will still find a way to limit its production and ownership in some way. They would just cause artificial scarcity to make sure that capital interests are upheld. There's more than one way to prevent such technology from being widely available. If a company that owns food production doesn't like the technology, they can just create fear propaganda. That is, if they don't buy the patent and hide it all together like what ExxonMobil did with their cars and electric. They can set the price or set in limitations that require you to buy new ones regularly, or even make sure they're consumable cartridges like what printers do. They can also do paywalls or subscription services that would like what Roomba did. A fucking vacuum that you bought that won't fucking work without a subscription. You will never see post-scarcity under capitalism because profits are more important than general society. The rich people who control the economy are more interested in their luxuries than building a society for the future of humanity. This is more likely that these devices would be far too expensive for the average person to ever own, so we'll be forced to continue to buy our own food. In some outcomes, it is even possible that this would create more desperation for the general masses as more work is taken away from the people through automation, or in this case, a machine that literally materializes food out of nothing. This actually works well for capitalists because, as I mentioned before, people who work in these fields will then have to find work elsewhere, and this means capitalists can drive wages even lower. Alright, let's look back to the thing about anti-capitalist movements now. The Outer Worlds was a secluded colony with a history of banning anything that doesn't fit scientism or the corporations. But as the quest with our companion Max proves, they couldn't get everything. The book Philosophism is based off of is interesting, and it seems to be a nod towards the Mikhail... I just butchered that name, but this guy. He's the father of anarchism, and I actually had very little idea who he was before playing the game. It's actually weird to me that this guy's writings exist in the world, but not Marx, Lenin, or Engels, or any of the socialist people actually know. For a game reflecting on capitalism and corporate practices, their solutions are trash. The best option we get is anarchism, but not to offend any of the anarchists watching. I won't be ripping into it too deeply. I just don't see anarchism as a good option due to its opposition to hierarchies. While yes, communism's goal is to remove state, class, and money, it usually uses state to achieve it, and then it disappears as this need diminishes. Anarchism rejects these entirely and looks for direct action through voluntary efforts in a horizontal democratic system. For me, it's obvious that this is an incredibly inefficient system, just waiting for an organized force to come and take over. There's anarcho-communism too, but this one just looks to remove the state right away to get to communism, which I can't get behind either. To have a classless, moneyless, stateless society, you need to develop a society capable of maintaining this. This means you need to build infrastructure, and it's much easier to do that with an organized state versus expecting people to agree on the correct course of action in a flat democracy.
Didn't I request no more fertilizer shipments be brought on board? Who keeps ordering these?
We have a lot of problems facing our planet, and most of these problems were caused by humans, and many of them could have been avoided. The ones who knew their actions were causing damage chose to keep it quiet so they can continue to make profits. The climate reports are only getting worse, and while we should listen to smart people, the suggestions being taken are the ones that capital approves of. These are things like carbon offsets, green hydrogen, and carbon capture technology. I know I just credited think tanks a fair amount in this video, but good data can be obtained from their research. It just needs to be critically reviewed to see what their selections were for calculating the information into statistics. While looking through studies, I found various pieces on climate change that show the issues from high-level emitters to low-level ones, but even within these articles, they use trash solutions to solve the problems that the market would be happy with, or the capital owners really, not necessarily in the market. They also love to push the personal responsibility take, regardless of if they contribute a lot or a little. Yes, we should all do our part, but it isn't going to change anything if the high-level emitters continue doing what they do. At some point when I was making this video, I found this clip of an air show that did this wall of fire, and this probably contributed more pollution than the American family does, but this did it in 35 seconds. You can find the video of this all over the internet. Carbon offsets are a popular solution now, but this video here does an amazing job at covering why these aren't going to fix anything. This is where I paused it and not the actual thumbnail. There are a lot of good reasons within the video, but they are essentially empty promises to postpone action. Carbon capture is also proven to be a failed technology just to postpone action. I'm pretty sure most of the companies that started carbon capture have failed at this point, so it's not really a viable solution. This one's going to be an expensive solution, but it's only really going to work for a few industries, and it's not going to be a wide-scale solution for the problem. Really, the reason why we get this one is because it's a very expensive thing that they'll get a lot of government funding for, and that creates a lot of shareholder value. The reason why we don't get solar energy as much is because it is kind of cheap, and it doesn't really provide a lot of shareholder value, so investing in it isn't really good. This is extremely important though, because companies have a duty to their shareholders, so they are required to make business decisions that benefit them. Even expanding into the stars, there are limitations to how much any facility can obtain Clive, the pig factory guy, he realized this and he even limited production. And you can see records of when the previous people were producing, and it got out of hand and it didn't work out. He is a small business owner and he doesn't really need to satisfy anyone but him and his cannibalism, so yeah. For the anti-capitalist options within the game, anarchism is not going to move society forward. Us taking an autocratic role could work for a bit, but as long as there's a benevolent leader, things could work out. No commentary in the game says the corporations left, and even Zora questions how you would really get rid of corporations, which I pointed out earlier in the video. If you weren't paying attention to the screen, then that's on you, which I guess is fine. I mean, that I add a lot of context to the screen, and I believe it's important, but you do you, though. I don't think very many people are going to go back and look for it, which is fine, so I might as well just expand on the idea. How it works is you prevent by law and enforcing that law private entities from doing business. You fulfill the needs of the people with state-run and regulated industry that doesn't provide opportunity for companies to fulfill the needs themselves. But of course, there's always room for individuals who don't want to be part of a workforce, and they could do things themselves, and that's also acceptable. But that's its own thing with its own special requirements. Even the Soviet Union had those, but that's its own thing. The United States made drugs illegal, and that made room for the illegal industry of narcotics, which allowed cartels and gangs and all that to make a lot of money. Now, if they were state-run regulated industries, this wouldn't be a big deal because people could just get all their drugs from the state-run and regulated industry and not from the illegal market. The Soviet Union also had problems with this, but theirs was caused by a second economy coming in to fulfill the needs that their first economy wasn't doing, and rather than enforce laws and expand their economy, they decided to just allow it. They made concessions to it, and it kind of influenced their society a lot more than it should have. To me, socialism is the path forward. Even when capital has done everything in its power to stomp it out, it is always fought on in the worker. If the USA didn't see socialism as a threat, they wouldn't put so much effort into stomping out socialist movements around the world. They put more effort into stomping out democratically elected socialist movements than they do places like Saudi Arabia that uses actual slave labor to do their shit. Capitalists need a country's resources so they can continue their growth, and having a socialist in charge who wants to nationalize them for the country is bad for capital. These people don't provide anything other than their wealth, which is stolen from the workers to begin with. Workers are the ones who extracted the resources that are used to make all the products in facilities built by workers, with workers who transport the goods where they are needed and are loaded and unloaded by workers. Workers manage the logistics of it all, while also being the ones who handle the transactions of the goods. Without skilled laborers, rich people can throw all the money they want at raw materials, but it's never going to turn it into products. Workers are the ones that run society, and our reward is to be exploited by the wealthy. This goes from the landlords that live off rent, which is just the labor of workers who can't afford to compete with the wealthy on the housing market, to the owners who never set foot in a business they collect profits from. Socialism puts resources to work for the people through democratic ownership of the means of production. This is the proletariat state working for the people who contribute to their ability. One that doesn't put capital interests first because they have no say. The people in each union decide on what is needed, and decisions are made based off of these needs. People wouldn't be allowed to live off labor of others like landlords do, or invest in a speculative market that benefit off the failure of others. And these monopolies are not going to work for the select few people that control it. Alright, so some context about pretty much everything. Capitalists don't always use the market, and there are a lot of nuances to the subject. A lot of the companies I complain about don't really compete on the market, and a lot of them even use central planning like Walmart and Amazon do. I just often take the stance that capitalism uses a market and socialism uses a planned economy or a mixed economy. But of course, nothing is as straightforward. China uses a market, but is socialist, and monopolies don't compete on a market, but are capitalist. This is actually fine to me because when you try to simplify topics for consumable media, you tend to lose a lot of nuances. You can just look at all the pretty much science videos online. There's so many nuances missing from every single video, but that's part of the game. If people want to learn more, they can read the papers and expand their knowledge on it by reading more in depth. But that stuff is super boring, so you gotta really have an interest for it. The world is extremely complicated, and to cover every nuance inside of a short YouTube video would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. I don't get help in my videos and can only do so much research in my free time. I believe in a planned economy with the democratic control of the means of production by the people who work within the unions of those who produce for it. This can happen in a couple different ways, but I imagine it kind of like how Project Cybersyn was supposed to work. It would have been great to see how well the project would have worked out in Chile, but the CIA had different things in mind, so yeah. People seem to have this idea that when we switch systems, we're just going to have to rebuild from scratch, which is not how things work. Factories can still be reopened. The ownership of the capitalists is just symbolic. Under socialism and the proletarian state, workers can be put first along with the environment. Right now, all decisions are made based on profits or the loss of profits. Nothing's easy, of course, but like we aren't in this alone. We have an entire class of workers who literally do everything already. We're just really getting rid of a small group of exploiters who are taking the surplus for themselves. The Hope colonists will certainly help Halcyon, but they aren't required. The colony has knowledge and skills even if they are a bit older and worn out. Even old 24th century technology is still going to be better than nothing. Even if it is based on the Gilded Era of our society, it's still futuristic technology. There's a lot of weird planning that doesn't seem to happen, and there's no commentary based on any of it, but like they could run a mission back to Earth. Like they have skip drive technology. They just have to like reverse engineer it, figure out what's going on, repair it. It's complicated. But literally, they just have the Hope scientists on top of this, so they can figure it out, find out what happened on Earth, find out information. It doesn't take a lifetime to do this stuff. Anyways, I think that's it. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't, give The Outer Worlds a try. I'm not sure why you would watch this video if you haven't played it, but I don't know. I guess I explained things to a person who's never played the game, so it doesn't matter. It's a really fun game and allows you to kill everyone you encounter, which is always a good game design. Just don't question the lack of children. Alright, gotta fucking edit this video now.